some shadows are not cast by lamplight, but by the weight of a guilty conscience. It begins on Baker Street, where a trembling clerk arrives with cryptic warnings that speak of betrayal, vengeance, and a figure long thought dead. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Now let us walk together into the fog of London, where Holmes waits to unmask the menace that lingers beyond the glass. It was upon one of those evenings, when the fog hung heavy over London, that I found myself returning alone from a late visit to a patient in Marylebone. The lamps along the street glowed faintly through the yellow mist, their light refracted into dim circles that seemed to hover in the air rather than illumine the pavement. The wheels of carriages rolled by, muffled and distant, and the footsteps of the few passers-by were lost almost before they reached the ear. A more oppressive atmosphere I cannot recall, for there was in it something of that stifling silence which compels the mind to wander into uneasy speculation. As I turned the familiar corner leading to Baker Street, my heart quickened with the thought of a warm fire and the companionship of my extraordinary friend. For though I was no stranger to solitary walks through London, I confess that night bore upon me with a sense of foreboding I could neither name nor cast off. It was as though the fog itself had eyes that watched, and that somewhere in the obscurity a presence waited, patient yet deliberate. I quickened my pace, glad to see the faint gleam of number 221B emerging through the vapour, though little did I suspect that even as I approached, a mystery of darker aspect had already taken root upon our very doorstep. It was then, as I raised my eyes toward the familiar windows above, that I perceived a solitary figure stationed across the street. He stood partially obscured by the shadow of a doorway, yet his posture bore the unmistakable mark of intent observation. His gaze, though I could not discern it directly, seemed fixed upon the lighted blinds of our sitting room, and the effect upon me was one of sudden chill, as though the damp of the fog had pierced to my very marrow. I halted for a moment, uncertain whether to cross directly or linger to determine his purpose. The man neither stirred nor sought concealment beyond the natural darkness in which he was enveloped. It was the stillness of his form that unnerved me most. A casual loiterer shifts his weight or turns his head, but this shadow gave no sign of motion. My instinct warned me that I beheld something more than chance idling. With a last glance backward, I mounted the steps of 221B, yet the impression of those unseen eyes followed me into the very threshold of our abode. Within, I found all as it ever was in that sanctuary of deduction. Holmes reclined in his armchair, pipe in hand, the curling smoke rising in blue spirals toward the ceiling. The glow of the fire played upon his sharp features, and his eyes, bright and keen as ever, regarded me with a glint of amusement. "You have been delayed, Watson," said he, without shifting from his repose. "Doubtless your patient insisted upon recounting symptoms irrelevant to his malady, and you, ever indulgent, lent a sympathetic ear. Judging by the faint red mark upon your glove, I infer also that the good man's household maintains a cat of fractious temper." I could not but smile at the accuracy of his observations. "You are, as ever, correct," I replied, laying aside my coat. "Though I must say, Holmes, the atmosphere without is such that I am grateful beyond words for the warmth of this room." He inclined his head slightly, though his gaze seemed fixed not upon me, but upon some thought of his own. It was in that moment I felt again the prickling unease that had seized me in the street. "You observed him also, then?" Holmes asked suddenly, as though plucking the thought from my very mind. "Observed whom?" I inquired, startled. "The fellow who has stationed himself across the street these 3 evenings past," Holmes replied coolly. "A tall man, shoulders slightly bowed, with the air of one accustomed to patient waiting. You saw him just now, I presume?" I admitted that I had, and confessed to the strange impression it had made upon me. Holmes nodded, tamping down the ash of his pipe. "Your instincts do you credit, Watson. Such perseverance in observation bespeaks no idle curiosity." He is there for a purpose, though whether in malice or mere watchfulness we have yet to learn. He conceals himself clumsily, but with a persistence that betrays design. The matter-of-factness of Holmes's tone did little to allay my disquiet. If my companion had deemed the figure worthy of note for several nights, then indeed the situation bore a gravity I could scarcely ignore. Holmes rose and moved to the window, drawing aside the curtain but an inch to cast a glance into the fog-laden street. When he turned again, his expression was composed, though the line of his mouth had hardened. "Mark me, Watson," said he quietly. "Such men are rarely harmless. A shadow that lingers grows ever nearer to substance, and substance, when driven by purpose, will act. I do not yet know whose hand directs him, nor what design is intended, but I warrant that this is but the prologue to a drama which shall soon demand our closest attention." His words, spoken with calm conviction, fell upon me with the weight of prophecy. Little did I imagine, as I settled into my chair opposite him, how true that warning would prove, and how deeply that lurking shadow would cast itself across the course of events to follow. The following morning broke with a pale light filtering through the curtains of Baker Street, and I awoke to find Holmes already at the breakfast table, immersed in the day's papers. The fire burned steadily, and the familiar comfort of our rooms seemed to stand in direct opposition to the unease which had overshadowed my mind since the previous night. The fog had lifted somewhat, though the memory of that motionless watcher still lingered with me as vividly as if he stood even then across the way. Holmes, for his part, betrayed no outward sign of disquiet. He poured himself a cup of coffee with his habitual precision, remarking only upon the relative dullness of the police reports. Yet I knew from the quick flicker of his eyes across the page and the faint contraction of his brow that his mind remained engaged with the mystery of the shadow. We had scarcely finished our meal when Mrs. Hudson appeared, bearing with her a card upon a tray. Holmes glanced at it briefly, and with that calm gravity which so often presaged the unfolding of some new adventure, informed me that a visitor sought our immediate counsel. A moment later, our door opened to admit a man whose appearance bespoke both fatigue and agitation. He was of slight build, his face pale, and his garments bore the creases of one who had passed a restless night. His eyes, restless and suspicious, flitted about the room as though expecting danger to emerge even from its familiar corners. Holmes, ever the master of composure, rose with a courteous inclination of the head and motioned him to a chair. I could not but observe how the man's hands trembled as he accepted the seat, nor how his lips compressed themselves into a thin line, as though words themselves had become an effort. "You are Mr. Edward Halberton, if I am not mistaken," Holmes said in his deliberate fashion, his glance moving from the visitor's ink-stained cuffs to the faint traces of ledger dust upon his sleeve. A clerk in a financial house, accustomed to long hours and meticulous figures, but lately afflicted by some influence which has robbed you of both appetite and sleep. The stranger gave a slight start, confirming by his very astonishment the accuracy of the deduction. "You are correct, sir," said he, his voice low and uneven. "It is precisely because of that influence that I come to you this morning." With a hand still unsteady, Halberton drew from his breast pocket a small sheaf of papers, folded with care yet smudged as though handled too often. He laid them upon the table before Holmes, who spread them delicately with his long fingers. I leaned forward, and together we read their singular contents. Each note, written in a cramped, angular hand, bore a message of singular brevity, yet of chilling import. They warned him, in varying words but in the same menacing tone, that he must not seek the light of Baker Street. One declared, "Turn your steps elsewhere, or darkness will claim you." Another threatened, "The eyes that follow you will not forgive disobedience." What struck me most was the peculiar choice of phrase, as if the writer possessed not merely hostility toward Halberton, but an especial dread of Holmes himself. The very mention of our address seemed both warning and threat. Holmes read each line with unhurried attention, his expression one of profound stillness. Only once did I perceive a glimmer of curiosity in his eyes, when he examined the faint watermark upon the paper. Halberton, meanwhile, sat in nervous silence, his gaze shifting between Holmes and myself, as though awaiting judgment from a tribunal. When Holmes at last looked up, it was with that penetrating steadiness which seldom failed to extract the truth. "You have received these over several days, Mr. Halberton. Yet until this morning you delayed seeking advice. Why?" The man coloured faintly, clasping his hands together as though to steady them. "I believed at first they were but the work of some mischief-maker," said he. "But as they continued, I felt compelled to act. I hoped, they would cease of their own accord." Holmes's gaze did not waver. "You speak as one who fears blackmail, yet these notes contain no explicit demand. What is it you have concealed?" Halberton shifted uneasily, his words faltering. "There was a time in my life when I kept company with men of rash ideas, political men you might call them. I cut those ties years ago. Still, I believe someone from that past seeks to torment me now." His manner convinced me of his sincerity, yet it was evident that he held something back. Holmes leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Partial truth, Watson," he murmured. "A veil drawn over the central fact. Our client is still unwilling to let us glimpse the true peril he faces." I confess I was moved by Halberton's distress. The perspiration stood upon his brow, and his fingers clutched at the arms of his chair as though it alone could anchor him. My instinct was to offer reassurance, to assure him that, under Holmes's guidance, no danger would remain unexplored or unchallenged. Yet Holmes displayed no such indulgence. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, seemed to strip away the man's feeble defences as easily as one parts a curtain. "You are afraid, Mr. Halberton," said he, "and with reason. Yet your silence places you in greater peril than any disclosure could. Fear without frankness is but an invitation to disaster." Halberton bowed his head, yet uttered no further confession. Holmes regarded him for a moment longer, then turned to me with the faintest trace of sardonic amusement. "You see, Watson, the curious inconsistency. The man trembles at shadows, yet refuses to strike a match against the darkness. It is a contradiction which we must resolve, for contradictions, like lies, are never long maintained." Thus the matter stood. My compassion urged me to comfort the unhappy clerk, while Holmes's intellect cut through all sentiment to the heart of the enigma. Between us, the stage was set for the unfolding of a drama whose menace had only just begun to reveal itself. When Halberton had departed, leaving us with more questions than answers, Holmes rose briskly from his chair and reached for his hat and cane. The languid air which had marked his demeanour through much of the interview was suddenly gone. In its place came that alert and eager energy which I had so often witnessed when a puzzle presented the faintest glimmer of solution. "We shall waste no time, Watson," said he. "The shadow has grown too bold to be disregarded. He lingers not from curiosity, but from compulsion, and compulsion is the lever by which men betray themselves. If we observe him, we may learn who drives him, or what." I followed, marvelling as always at the sharp transition between repose and action in my companion. The ordinary fog of London had thickened once more, enfolding Baker Street in its damp embrace, and I could not help but feel that we stepped from warmth into an arena already prepared for some unseen contest. Holmes had scarcely set foot upon the pavement before he paused, his gaze bent toward the flagstones near the lamp-post opposite. I joined him and perceived there, among the faint tracings of carriage wheels and hurried feet, a single impression more distinct than the rest. "You perceive, Watson," Holmes remarked, kneeling with careless disregard for the moisture, "a footprint deep set, with clay adhering to the heel. Yet observe the singularity. It is of a soil foreign to this street." I bent closer and saw that he spoke truly. The substance was thicker, darker, and bore within it small fragments of chalky grit, unlike the clean paving of Marylebone. It is the trace of a man who has stood his ground rather than passed in haste, Holmes continued. And he has done so more than once, for the repetition of the mark shows him to be patient in his watch. The sight stirred in me a renewed sense of apprehension, for it proved that the lurking figure of the night before had not been the offspring of my imagination, but a sentinel whose presence could no longer be dismissed. Holmes rose, eyes alight, already forming his next move. Without hesitation, Holmes led me down a side street where, with a soft whistle, he summoned one of his youthful allies. Wiggins, a sharp-eyed lad with an instinct for mischief, appeared as though conjured from the fog itself. At Holmes's beckoning, half a dozen other ragged urchins emerged, each ready to lend their wits to his service. "You will shadow the shadow," Holmes instructed, his tone grave. "Mark where he lodges, where he feeds, and with whom he speaks. A penny for each report, 2 for the man who first brings me his place of rest." The boys nodded eagerly, their faces aglow with the thrill of secret enterprise. They melted away into the alleys, scattering like small phantoms through the morning haze. I could not but reflect, as I watched them vanish, upon the singular resources Holmes commanded. Where the machinery of officialdom lumbered, he possessed this nimble core, whose loyalty to him was absolute, and whose eyes were as keen as their feet were swift. As we retraced our steps, Holmes's glance swept along the gutter with that tireless scrutiny which seldom failed to reward him. Presently, he stooped and retrieved a small scrap of paper, damp from the mist, yet still legible in part. "Ah, what have we here?" he murmured, spreading it against the lamplight. The fragment bore upon it a series of marks, intersecting lines and curious symbols that conveyed no meaning to my untutored eye. "It resembles no common writing," I remarked, peering at it with perplexity. "Just so," Holmes replied. "It is a cipher, rudimentary, yet effective for those initiated into its method. The hand is not recent, the ink betrays some age, yet its presence here and now is of peculiar significance." He slipped the paper carefully into his pocketbook. "This, Watson, is a thread. We must follow it, for even the frailest strand once drawn may unroll the whole skein." I felt a stir of excitement, tempered by the sombre thought that the hand which had dropped this scrap might be the very same which haunted the pavement of our street. That evening, by the fire, Holmes laid the scrap upon the table and, with pen and paper, began to trace its hidden meaning. "Do you recall, Watson," said he, "the fevered agitations of certain radical societies some 20 years past? Their methods were crude, but they adopted codes such as this for their correspondence." I confessed my ignorance, and he continued, "The structure is unmistakable. Each symbol stands for a letter, arranged in transposition. A few strokes here, and behold, a word emerges." He sketched rapidly, and before my eyes, letters began to form, fragments of sentences invoking loyalty, secrecy, vengeance. The implication was unmistakable. "This cipher is of the same hand once used by a faction now thought extinct," Holmes declared. "Yet someone has resurrected it, and that someone loiters within sight of Baker Street. Whether his purpose be political or personal cloaked in politics remains to be seen." I could not repress a shiver at the notion that ancient conspiracies might once again stir in the very heart of London, with ourselves drawn unwittingly into their orbit. Holmes, however, regarded the paper as calmly as though it were but a page of an old ledger. The following day, while Holmes conversed with a constable at the corner, I lingered near a cab stand, where an elderly driver, his face ruddy and weather-beaten, was eager to unburden his tale. "I seen him plain as you stand there, sir," said he, lowering his voice, "a tall fellow with hollow cheeks and eyes that burned like coals. It fair gave me a turn, for he was the very likeness of a man I knew in younger days, Jared Blythe his name, who was said to have died in prison long ago." The words struck me with peculiar force, for they lent a spectral air to the figure whose presence already seemed unnatural. I carried the account to Holmes, who listened without visible emotion. "Dead men cast long shadows, Watson," he remarked. But shadows are not spirits. We must beware the treachery of imagination. As we returned to Baker Street, my mind was far from tranquil. The muddy footprint, the cipher, the cabman's tale, all pointed toward a web of intrigue in which past sins and present fears were interwoven. Most disturbing of all was the suggestion that the shadow resembled a man long thought dead. Holmes preserved his silence, offering neither comfort nor conjecture. His eyes, half closed, betrayed only that inward absorption which heralded the shaping of some theory. I confess my heart grew heavy, for while he moved with the assurance of one who already discerned the outline of truth, I was left to wrestle with the uncanny fear that we pursued not a man, but a revenant. In the days which followed, Holmes and I became increasingly conscious of the figure that haunted our steps. No longer did he linger in doorways or retreat into the shelter of fog. Instead, he followed us openly through the crowded thoroughfares, maintaining always that precise distance which bespoke calculation rather than chance. I recall vividly one such afternoon when Holmes led me along Oxford Street in apparent idleness. Turning suddenly, I observed the same tall man with bowed shoulders threading his way among the passers-by. His face was half concealed by the brim of his hat, yet his intent was manifest in the constancy of his pursuit. Holmes appeared not in the least disconcerted. Indeed, a faint smile touched his lips as he remarked, "The hawk grows bold, Watson. Boldness in a hunter is but the prelude to folly, and folly is the moment when the quarry springs his trap." Though his composure reassured me, I confess that a chill settled upon my spirit, for the notion of being shadowed thus by one whose design remained obscure filled me with a sense of impending calamity. It was evident that the mystery, far from dissipating, was closing more tightly about us. When we reported to Halberton that the shadow now pursued us without concealment, the effect upon him was startling. His lips grew bloodless, and, staggering to a chair, he pressed his hands against his face as though to shut out the vision. "I can endure no more," he cried, his voice quivering with exhaustion. "The strain of these days has unstrung my nerves. You do not know, you cannot know, what terror grips me when I hear that name or see that form." Holmes regarded him with steady eyes, offering neither consolation nor rebuke. I, however, could not but feel the man's anguish keenly. He trembled in every limb, his frame convulsed by sobs which he strove vainly to suppress. At length he sank back, pale and spent, like one who has wrestled with an unseen adversary and been overcome. It was clear that his secret, long withheld, now pressed upon him with a force too great to be denied. It was in that moment of collapse that Halberton yielded. With a sudden gesture, he rose again, his eyes wild, and he paced the room with the restless step of a man driven at last to confession. "Years ago," he said hoarsely, "in the folly of my youth, I consorted with men whose talk was of revolution and violence. They spoke of justice, but practiced treachery. I knew them, yet I lacked the courage to sever myself honourably. Then came a night, dark, bitter, and unforgettable, when I betrayed one of them." He paused, his breath catching as though the memory strangled him. The police had watched our gatherings. They needed but a name, a word, and I gave it. To save myself, to escape the ruin that threatened, I pointed out the man whose zeal was fiercest. They seized him. I saw his face as he was dragged away. Never shall I forget the look of despair and hatred in his eyes. He sank once more into his chair, burying his face in his hands. Since that hour I have lived with the weight of my perfidy. The world believed him dead. I clung to that belief as a drowning man to driftwood. Yet now I see his shadow on every wall. He has returned for me. His words fell with the heavy finality of doom, and the silence which followed seemed charged with the very breath of guilt. When at last Halberton raised his head, his voice had sunk to a whisper, as though the utterance of the name itself might summon a spectre. "His name," said he, "was Jared Blythe. He was the most ardent, the most relentless of all our company. His fiery speeches stirred men's blood, and his defiance of the law was open and unflinching. They sentenced him to imprisonment. It was said he perished there. But I tell you, the man who dogs me through the streets, the figure I glimpse in the fog, is none other than Jared himself. His eyes darted towards the window, as though expecting the apparition even then. The quiver of his lips and the pallor of his cheeks bore witness to the sincerity of his dread. I confess that his conviction impressed itself upon me, for I too had heard the cabman's tale of a face familiar from the past, and it seemed as though all evidence pointed to the impossible. Holmes, however, remained unmoved. He tapped the ash from his pipe and regarded Halberton with an air of calm detachment. "Your fears are natural, sir, but let us not mistake shadows for phantoms. Dead men do not rise from prison graves. What you have seen is a likeness, exploited by one who knows your conscience to be vulnerable. Fear magnifies resemblance, until the mind fashions a ghost where only a man stands." Halberton looked at him with desperate incredulity. "But the face, the very eyes." Holmes raised his hand. "The eyes you saw are those which memory paints. Trust not to them. The true question is not whether Jared Blythe lives, but who profits by persuading you that he does." I could not but marvel at Holmes's composure, for where Halberton perceived the supernatural and I, the tragic, he discerned only the cold outline of logic. Yet in his very calmness there lurked a promise of revelation yet to come. That evening the air lay heavy upon Baker Street, the silence broken only by the slow rumble of an occasional cab and the faint jingle of harness in the mist. Within our sitting room, the hours passed in uneasy watchfulness. Halberton, restless and drawn, paced to and fro, glancing often toward the window, as though dreading the sight of some spectral figure in the street below. At length, unable to endure confinement, he declared his intention of stepping out for a few breaths of air. Holmes regarded him in silence for a moment, then gave a slight inclination of the head. "Do not wander far," he said, in a tone that conveyed both permission and warning. I accompanied our client down to the doorway, determined not to leave him unattended. Yet even as I set foot upon the pavement, I was struck by the oppressive stillness that hung over the street, as though the fog itself waited. Halberton drew his cloak tightly about him and moved a few paces forward, his figure dim in the haze. At that instant, the stillness broke, and from the very shadow of the lamppost leapt forth a shape with startling ferocity. The assailant flung himself upon Halberton with the violence of a beast, a knife flashing in the dim light. Halberton uttered a cry of terror and struggled desperately against his attacker, whose gaunt form pressed him back toward the railings with murderous intent. I rushed forward, my stick raised, and struck at the figure with all the force I could muster. The blow landed upon his arm, causing him to stagger and release his grip for a moment. Halberton, half fainting, collapsed against the railings, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The assailant, however, recovered with astonishing swiftness. He turned upon me with a snarl, his eyes gleaming from beneath the shadow of his hat. For an instant, I felt the chill of recognition. That gaunt visage was indeed akin to the description Halberton had given of Jared Blythe. Yet before I could steady myself for another blow, the man darted into the fog with a speed that made pursuit impossible. Holmes, who had emerged in time to see the retreating figure, raised his hand. "Let him go, Watson," he commanded. "We gain nothing by wild chase in this murk. Observe instead what he leaves behind." His eyes, keen and alight, had already fallen upon a dark bundle near the pavement. Holmes stooped and lifted the object, a heavy cloak, discarded in the struggle. He shook it once, and a faint dust rose into the air, carrying with it a distinct odour that struck me with its acrid familiarity. "Coal dust, Watson," said he quietly, "and not the common soot of a hearth, but the sharp tang of freshly handled fuel. Observe also the wear at the hem, scraped and frayed as though dragged repeatedly across rough timber." He spread the garment along the four railings, his eyes travelling over its seams with swift precision. "The cut is cheap, but practical. It has served him as both covering and disguise. In casting it aside, our assailant has betrayed more than he intended. Halberton, trembling, leaned heavily against me as Holmes folded the cloak. His lips moved, but no words emerged, his fear so great that he seemed scarcely able to comprehend the peril from which he had escaped. Holmes, however, appeared invigorated, as though the cloak were a page torn from the book of the criminal's life, ready to be read by his discerning eye. Holmes held the cloak before the fire upon our return to Baker Street, brushing away the dust with careful fingers. Note, Watson, how the fibres are impregnated with coal, not merely stained by passing contact. This cloak has lain where coal is heaped, shifted, and trodden daily. Such places abound only near the railway goods yards. I followed his reasoning with growing clarity. Then the man conceals himself in some shed or lodging adjacent to the tracks. Precisely, Holmes replied. There he finds not only seclusion, but a labyrinth of hiding places, with the added advantage of swift escape by train, should danger press too close. It is a haunt well suited to one whose trade is menace. He placed the cloak aside and regarded Halberton with grave intensity. Your adversary has roots in the very dust of industry, Mr. Halberton. He will not easily be dislodged. Yet we may now narrow the circle within which to seek him. Halberton shuddered at the words, as though the spectre of his enemy rose vividly before him in the smoke and cinders of the yard. In the hours that followed, I urged Halberton to remain within the safety of our rooms. Here at least, I said, you are guarded by Holmes's vigilance and the constancy of my own watch. To venture again into the streets would be to court destruction. Halberton seized eagerly upon my words, as though they offered a lifeline. He clung to the notion that Baker Street was a fortress against the storm that gathered around him. Holmes, however, stood at the window, his figure dark against the pale glow of the lamps outside. Take care, Watson, he said in a tone of quiet gravity. It is often within walls we deem most secure that the enemy strikes hardest. Safety assumed is but another form of peril. His words fell with chilling weight, for they implied that the shadow which haunted our steps had not yet played his hand to the fullest. I confess my own confidence faltered, though I masked it for Halberton's sake. For if Holmes believed danger lay beneath our very roof, then indeed no corner of Baker Street might be free from menace. It was later that same evening, when the echoes of the assault still lingered in our minds, that Holmes at last broke his prolonged silence. He sat with his elbows upon his knees, his fingers pressed together, and his gaze fixed not upon us, but upon the fire, as though its flickering depths concealed the very lines of his reasoning. My dear Watson, said he at length, our phantom is no phantom at all. Jared Blythe lies where prison walls consigned him years ago. Dead. Men do not stride fog-bound streets, nor do they cast shadows at our very door. The likeness, however, is too precise to be coincidence. There is, you see, a younger brother, Silas Blythe, a man consumed by the fire of vengeance and by the delusion that he must avenge the dishonour dealt his kin. I started at his words. Then it is Silas who dogs us, and for no other reason than to punish Halberton for his betrayal. Reason enough, Holmes replied coldly. Family loyalty, once infected by fanaticism, becomes as deadly a motive as greed or envy. The man's entire existence is narrowed to one purpose, to hound his brother's betrayer until he lies at his feet. As Holmes spoke, I recalled the gaunt features glimpsed in the street, the likeness that so terrified Halberton. In that moment, the shadow assumed flesh, and yet the horror was scarcely diminished, for the vengeance of the living seemed no less relentless than that of the dead. Holmes leaned back, his expression hardening. Now, Watson, we must prepare the snare. Despite his clarity in one respect, Holmes was by no means disposed to reveal the entire structure of his plan. He spoke in fragments, casting out deductions like sparks which flared and died before they could kindle fully in my comprehension. You will observe, Watson, he said, that the man's audacity is increasing. Boldness is both his strength and his weakness. He cannot refrain from the chase. If we supply him with the quarry, his own impatience will deliver him into our hands. I pressed him for particulars, but he merely smiled that thin smile which always betokened knowledge withheld. Patience, my good fellow. A chess player does not reveal his endgame until the board compels it. We have but to wait, and all will be apparent. Thus I was left in that state of mingled curiosity and unease so familiar to me, aware that Holmes perceived the path with unerring vision, while I must stumble forward by faith alone. On the following night, Holmes set his design in motion. A closed carriage was drawn up at our door, its horses steaming faintly in the chill. Halberton, pale and trembling, was persuaded to enter, though Holmes gave him but scant instruction, merely bidding him to sit in silence and show himself at certain moments through the window. "It is essential," Holmes whispered to me, "that word of his departure spread quickly. Our adversary will not resist the bait." He arranged matters with characteristic precision. A stable boy was dispatched with casual hints, a cabman bribed to speak freely at the stand, and within half an hour rumour had already sped along the street that Halberton was bound for Paddington. The carriage rolled off into the fog, its lamps glowing faintly as it vanished round the corner. Holmes and I followed at a discreet interval on foot, keeping to the shadows. His eyes gleamed with that fierce light, which I had come to recognise as the herald of pursuit. "The game is in motion, Watson," he murmured. "We must tread softly, for the hunter becomes the hunted only when he least suspects it." It was not long before we discerned a figure gliding through the mist, keeping the same measured distance behind the carriage that had so unnerved us before. His gait was unmistakable, stooped yet deliberate, with that peculiar swing of the shoulders which marked him at once as the man of our vigil. Holmes touched my arm lightly, and we slowed our pace. "You perceive, Watson, how readily he takes the bait. He is drawn as irresistibly as the moth to the flame." The carriage wound its way through a succession of streets, the glow of its lamps bobbing faintly ahead. Behind it the shadow pressed on, never hastening, never flagging, his intent written in every line of his form. I confess that my pulse quickened as I watched the drama unfold. It seemed to me as though we walked within a net of silence, each step bringing us nearer to the climax, yet each moment prolonging the dreadful suspense. Holmes, however, moved with the same quiet assurance, his gaze fixed upon the quarry, as though reading in him the very thoughts of his mind. At last the carriage turned into a dim yard, half enclosed by shuttered warehouses. Holmes drew me aside into the shelter of a doorway where we could observe unseen. The lamps of the carriage cast a feeble glow, illuminating the drifting mist in pale circles of light. The shadow advanced slowly, pausing once to glance about, then stealing forward with the stealth of a predator upon its prey. My heart beat thickly in my breast, and the silence seemed to magnify each faint creak and rustle until they swelled into portents of catastrophe. Holmes stood motionless beside me, his figure rigid with intent. I dared not speak, scarcely dared to breathe, so tense was the expectancy of that moment. All around us London slept, yet within that yard the air quivered with the imminence of conflict. I felt, as I watched, that the net was closing, and that the fate of Halberton, of ourselves, and of the shadow who pursued us was about to be determined in the stillness of the night. The carriage, bearing our trembling client within, turned from the main thoroughfare into a desolate yard, where shuttered warehouses loomed like sentinels of industry long abandoned. The lamps upon its panels shed a wavering glow, throwing monstrous shadows across heaps of coal stacked against the walls. The air was thick with the acrid scent of dust, and the muffled silence of that place struck me with a foreboding deeper than the clamour of a crowd. Holmes and I stole into the shelter of a doorway, from which vantage we might observe without being observed. The horses stamped restlessly, their breath rising in faint clouds, while the driver maintained a studied indifference that bespoke careful instruction. For several moments nothing stirred save the fog itself, which crept about the yard in ghostly tendrils. Then, from the outer darkness, came the faintest scrape of a foot upon gravel. My hand tightened involuntarily upon my stick. Holmes inclined his head toward me, his lips compressed, his eyes shining with that cold brilliance which heralded the crisis of a case. We waited. The tension wound like a spring as the figure at last emerged from the mist. Step by step the man advanced, his form looming ever clearer as he crossed the open yard. His shoulders stooped, his stride deliberate, and in his right hand gleamed the outline of a blade, long and narrow, that caught the dim light of the carriage lamps. Holmes raised a finger, commanding silence. I scarcely breathed, my heart hammering at the sight of the very shadow that had haunted our days and nights. His eyes glared from beneath the brim of his hat, fixed upon the carriage with an intensity that bespoke murderous resolve. The driver shifted in his seat as though in unease, and the man froze for an instant, crouched low like some creature of the night, before gliding nearer, his weapon poised. In that moment, I beheld not merely a stalker, but a predator whose intent was written in every taut movement of his body. Holmes's hand touched my sleeve, steady, implacable. I knew the signal. The time to spring lay close, yet not until the net was drawn to its tightest. The pursuer, oblivious to the danger gathering about him, crept forward into the circle of light that would betray him utterly. Holmes moved first, swift and noiseless as a cat. He darted from the shadows, interposing himself between the carriage and the assailant. Startled by the sudden apparition, the man recoiled, but only for an instant, for he rushed upon Holmes with the ferocity of a madman. I leapt to my friend's aid, my stick raised. The clash that followed was fierce and breathless. The man swung his blade in desperate arcs, forcing Holmes to parry with his cane, while I struck from the side in an effort to unbalance him. His strength was astonishing, his movements those of one driven less by skill than by the blind impetus of hatred. The scuffle echoed through the empty yard, the crash of boots on gravel, the rasp of steel upon wood, the harsh breaths of men locked in mortal struggle. Twice he nearly broke free, and twice Holmes flung him back with an iron grip. At last, with a combined effort, we bore him to the ground, wrenching the knife from his grasp as he writhed and cursed beneath us. Pinned against the stones, he glared upward with eyes that burned in the lamplight. Foam flecked his lips, and his chest heaved as though the very fury within him sought to tear its way free. Even subdued, his presence struck terror, for in every line of his face there blazed the desperate will of one who lives for vengeance alone. Holmes tore the hat from the man's head, and the dim light fell full upon his features. I gasped, for there, in that gaunt face, lay the unmistakable likeness of Jared Blythe, as Halberton had described him. Yet beneath the semblance of the dead burned a youthfulness that betrayed the truth. "Silas Blythe," said Holmes coldly, his eyes fixed upon the prisoner. "You play the part of your brother well, but the years have not lined your brow as they lined his. The resemblance is your weapon, and you have wielded it with devilish cunning." The man's lips curled into a grimace of defiance. "You speak as though it were falsehood," he hissed, "but I am his blood, his voice, his vengeance." Halberton, who had emerged trembling from the carriage, uttered a cry of horror. "Great heavens! It is his face! It is Jared returned!" "No," said Holmes firmly. "The grave holds Jared. This is his brother, who has cloaked himself in the guise of the dead to strike terror into your guilty heart." The truth hung heavy in the air, more dreadful in its reality than any phantom. Silas Blythe, though bound, reared up with a sudden force, his voice rising in a torrent of rage. "You think to thwart me with ropes and reason," he cried, "but the vow I made cannot be undone. Halberton shall pay. He betrayed my brother to the chains of the law, and in the darkness of his cell Jared wasted, cursed, and died. Do you hear me, Clark? His ghost walks not in the churchyard, but in me. I swore he should fall beneath my hand, and I would strike him where he felt safest, beneath the very window of Baker Street, under the eye of the great detective who shields him." His words rang through the yard with such intensity that even I shuddered, though I saw the madness that clouded his reason. Halberton shrank back, white and trembling, while Holmes looked down upon the prisoner with an expression that was at once stern and sorrowful. "You have revealed enough," Holmes said quietly. "Your vengeance ends here, Silas Blythe. No man, however wronged, has the right to play executioner beneath the guise of justice." Thus the vow was spoken, not in triumph, but in defeat, the echo of a hatred too long nursed. It was near dawn when we returned to Baker Street, bearing with us both our shaken client and the fragments of the night's grim encounter. The familiar glow of our sitting-room gas lamps seemed almost unreal after the dim yard and its violent struggle, yet it lent a steadiness to nerves that had been sorely tried. Halberton sank into a chair, his face haggard and his hands still trembling, while Holmes, with unruffled composure, divested himself of his coat and took his accustomed place by the fire. For some minutes silence reigned, broken only by the ticking of the clock and the faint hiss of the gas. I busied myself in restoring Halberton with a draught of brandy, yet his eyes wandered restlessly toward Holmes, as though awaiting a verdict from some tribunal of reason. At last my companion leaned forward, his keen gaze fixed upon our client. "The chain is complete, Watson," he said. "Each link lies plain before us. Let us now lay it out, that Mr. Halberton may learn how near he came to ruin at the hands of Silas Blythe." Holmes spread the crumpled warnings upon the table, smoothing them with deliberate care. "These notes, sir," said he, "are no invention of recent malice. They are fragments culled from the writings of your former associate, Jared Blythe. His speeches, once copied and circulated among the radicals, were preserved by his brother and employed to heighten the illusion of his return." He held one to the light, pointing to the peculiar cadence of the phrasing. "Observe the style, fiery, elliptical, and infused with that peculiar rhetoric of vengeance. Silas required no effort of imagination, only a pen and the memory of his brother's words, to fashion these missives. It was a master stroke of psychological warfare, for what could more unnerve you than to hear again the very voice you had silenced?" Halberton shuddered, his lips moving without sound. I could not but pity the man, for the device had indeed been devilishly contrived, and upon a conscience already burdened, it fell with a weight more dreadful than any physical threat. Holmes next drew from his pocket a scrap of dried clay, which he laid upon the mantelpiece. "Here, Watson, is the second link. You recall the footprint discovered outside our door. Its substance was not the clean stone dust of Marylebone, but a clay impregnated with coal." He turned to Halberton. "That same clay, sir, is found only where coal yards are but upon the railway lines. Our prisoner, as I have since ascertained, maintained a rough lodging above such a yard. In his cloak, discarded during the struggle, I found fibres thick with this very dust. Thus the phantom betrayed his refuge by the soil upon his heel." The logic was unanswerable. I marvelled once again at Holmes's precision, by which the merest particle became a beacon leading to truth. Halberton, however, sat with bowed head, as though each fresh proof were another stone laid upon his breast. Holmes resumed, his voice calm, almost clinical. "The most potent deception lay not in the notes nor the cloak, but in your own imagination, Mr. Halberton. You believed yourself haunted by the dead, because the living man bore his brother's likeness. The Blythes, as I have discovered, were much alike in feature. Add to this the guilty vision of one who had wronged the elder, and you conjured not a man, but a revenant. I could not but reflect upon the uncanny resemblance I myself had glimpsed in the dim light. Yet hearing Holmes speak, the illusion melted into rationality. It is the oldest trick of fear, Holmes continued, to make the mind its accomplice. You saw what you dreaded most, and dread transformed resemblance into certainty." Halberton buried his face in his hands. "God help me," he whispered. "I saw Jared risen from the grave." Holmes's expression did not soften. "You saw what guilt permitted you to see. The eyes betray the heart, more surely than any disguise." At last Halberton broke into speech, his voice hoarse with long-suppressed agony. "It is true. I betrayed him. Jared trusted me as a comrade, yet I delivered him to the law to shield my own cowardice. From that hour, I have lived with the weight of his downfall. Each note was a summons from the grave, each shadow in the street his avenging spirit. I am undone, gentlemen. No safety can restore me to peace. He covered his face, and I, moved by his misery, sought words of comfort. But Holmes forestalled me with a gesture. Truth, Mr. Halberton, said he, is no respecter of comfort. It exposes, it chastens, and it leaves no man unscarred. You cannot escape the shadow you cast in years past. It walks with you still. Halberton groaned, and silence fell once more. I confess I was troubled by Holmes's severity, yet I could not deny its justice. For betrayal leaves an imprint deeper than any footprint in clay, and no reasoning, however clear, may wholly efface the shadow of conscience. When at last Halberton took his leave, the dawn light had already crept faintly into the London sky. He went forth a broken man, his step faltering, his face ashen with the weight of memory and exposure. We watched him descend the stair in silence, neither Holmes nor I attempting a word of comfort, for there are burdens which no hand can lift from another. The door closed behind him, and an unearthly stillness seemed to fall upon Baker Street. The tumult of the night, the clash of limbs in the darkened yard, the prisoner's furious cries, all these now seemed like echoes of a fevered dream. Within our rooms, the steady glow of the gas lamps, the ticking of the clock, and the faint crackle of the fire restored outward calm. Yet beneath that surface tranquillity lingered a current of unease. I confess that my own mind remained restless, haunted by the sight of Halberton's stricken face and the venomous passion of Silas Blythe. Outside, the city stirred to life once more, but within those walls there brooded the memory of shadows not easily dispelled. I realized then how silence itself may be more oppressive than sound when it falls after violence. Left alone for a time, while Holmes occupied himself with his papers, I sat before the fire and allowed my thoughts to wander. The crackle of the coals seemed to murmur with voices, and in each flame I fancied the shadow of a man's conscience burning unseen. For was it not conscience more than any enemy that had brought Halberton to his knees? It is a singular truth that men may bury their deeds beneath years of routine, yet the past lies always in ambush. Halberton had lived outwardly a respectable life, diligent in his work and modest in his manner. But deep within him lay the scar of a single act of betrayal. That wound had festered in silence until the figure of Silas Blythe tore it open, and the shadow of Jared rose from memory to exact its due. I pondered how many such shadows walk beside us daily, unseen by the world yet ever present to those who bear them. Some men mask them with laughter, others with toil, but in the quiet hours the shadow returns, unbidden and inexorable. And though it cast no shape upon the wall, its weight is heavier than stone. It was in this mood of sombre reflection that Holmes, who had been silent for long, turned his keen gaze upon me. "You meditate, Watson," said he, "upon the nature of shadows. Allow me to complete the thought. The most perilous shadows are not those born of fog or lamplight, but those which men carry within, the shadows of guilt, delusion, and fear." He leaned back, his thin fingers steepled. Silas Blythe exploited such shadows with consummate craft. He knew that Halberton's conscience would supply the ghost more vividly than any disguise. Indeed, had Halberton been guiltless, the likeness would have struck him as but a passing resemblance. But guilt sharpened every line, coloured every glance, and turned a living man into the revenant of the dead. Thus conscience may prove more treacherous than any adversary, for it arms our enemies with phantoms of our own making. I listened, struck as ever by the cold precision of his reasoning. Yet beneath his words, I sensed an unspoken note of pity, not for Halberton alone, but for all mankind who must carry their shadows from cradle to grave. Holmes rose and paced before the hearth. "The lesson is plain. Guard the heart, Watson, for the mind may defend against every logic save that which springs from its own remorse. Shadows born within are the hardest to dispel. He spoke without emphasis, yet the weight of his words lingered long after. For my own part, I could not rest content with Holmes's unyielding logic alone. The spectacle of Halberton's collapse, the confession torn from him by dread, and the frenzy of Silas Blythe left upon me an impression of human frailty rather than of abstract deduction. It seemed to me that in this drama villain and victim were not easily separated. Halberton's weakness had been culpable, yet who among us is free from moments when fear triumphs over honour? And Silas, consumed by vengeance, was himself but another prisoner, bound by loyalty so twisted into madness that it destroyed both its object and its bearer. Thus, I was left with a melancholy compassion for both men, one ruined by his treachery, the other by his fidelity. Between them stood Holmes, austere and detached, reading their fates as if they were problems upon a slate. Yet I, who had seen the tears of one and the fury of the other, could not but feel the tragedy of it all. For in the end, both were shadows, one of guilt, the other of vengeance, and both alike were lost to the light. As the day waned, Holmes and I stood once more at the window of our sitting room. Outside, the fog drifted heavily through Baker Street, softening the outlines of hansom cabs and muffling the cries of vendors. The gas lamps glowed faintly, their circles of light swallowed almost at once by the mist. It was as though the world itself had wrapped in shadow to seal the memory of the night's events. Holmes, his hands clasped behind him, gazed steadily outward, his profile sharp against the dim glow. I remained silent, unwilling to disturb his reverie, though my own thoughts stirred with sombre weight. At last he spoke, his tone quiet yet distinct. "There, Watson, are shadows enough for London, yet none so dangerous as those we have seen within men's hearts." With that, he turned back to his chair, reaching for his pipe with the air of one who has closed a chapter. I, however, lingered at the window. The drifting fog seemed to me emblematic of the human soul, opaque, concealing, and filled with shapes that only the conscience of each man might perceive. Thus the case of Edward Halberton ended, leaving in its wake a lesson more enduring than any arrest or triumph, that the gravest mysteries are often those cast not upon the street, but upon the mind. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the smoke from his pipe curling upward in delicate spirals. His gaze was fixed upon the fire, yet his words were measured and precise. "Watson, men are seldom pursued by the dead, but far more often by their own guilty memories. The true spectres of this world are not born of graveyards, but of conscience." I could not help but nod, for in Edward Halberton's torment there lay a truth that touched all men. And now I put a question to you. What do you believe was Silas Blythe's gravest mistake? His ruthless devotion to vengeance, or his cunning attempt to cloak himself in the shadow of the dead? If you enjoyed this mystery, share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more tales of Holmes's remarkable cases, and pass the story along to fellow admirers of the great detective. Another adventure, perhaps darker still, awaits just beyond the fog.